This week, I'll tell you what I'm not covering, and then I think it's about time I uncovered those moments and times on the front lines that suck. When the powers that be unleash their flailing pawns to break us and to stop us. As we recognize the need to recognize our own and each other's health and wellness, hear the tale of two activists who are neither broken nor stopping. And lastly, but most of the budget, our military. But first, I'm a hypocrite. Hypocrisy, let me see, survey the scene. Please, allow me. Let me be bold, let me take hold of the pieces of soul that I sold to hold this new phone. Swipe and release the keys that I strike with guilt and with ease. The evil I fight from a cracked misfit creed, not belief, no, I know that I'm far from perfect. I think if it's worth it every time that I ponder the price of this bottled water I poured on her eyes as more rounds of tear gas choked out the sky, buried the light in a capitalist fire built on a pyre of justice and right. Is it wrong to sit at this cold screen, battle the smoke screen, to wrap some dissent in a hypocritic covenant? Yes, this is meant to show you that I know. Oh yes, I know. I've thought of it, hated it, grated my mind with all the reasons that I could find to never buy in to the sick, twisted slime, the torture of planet and people and kind. I've gone spelunking in what if I dug deep so kids in the caves wouldn't have to. I've swung the abyss, insanity's kiss, a free fall, a near miss. I've battled the logic, thinking it toxic, but always come back to the edge, standing over that pit. Never quite balanced, an uneasy ballast without any malice, but evil does live here. Yes, I do shower, use dirty power. Yes, some of the plastic that floats in the ocean, a viscous sick potion is mine. One of those drops, a dripping mistake from glaciers now fading 1,000 times faster than this earth can make them. Trace me, place that drop, let it drip. Where choices are strewn, my mind's open wound, a flight I did take, a road trip, a band tour. Yes, my life is laced with these picks and verdicts, year after year, another step made to avert it, but still never reaching perfect. Dodging the ills with matrix-like skill, but bullets will hit. Hypocrisy sticks, wading through toxic sludge of my own making, forming a fist because I'm still raising hell. Yes, on the front lines, head cocked to the sky, I'll call out the villains, the corporate goons willing to keep on gold digging, ramp up the drilling, who cares where it's spilling, people and planet ripe for the killing. No, I won't shudder inside, be quiet and hide simply because I cannot derive the perfect conclusion to topple the system from far outside. I cannot find a way to keep tear gas from burning my eyes without pouring water, perhaps from a bottle, to spread information, a Wi-Fi location, digital stations, these potent creations from sick corporations that torture, pollute, persecute, loot. Yes, who will push us to progress, save what we have left? If I were to sit here and wait for the powers that be to let me be free, to plant justice seeds, I'd simply reap the death of this world. And then what a great hypocrite I would be. To seek freedom, justice, then step back and leave? This quarrel inside will rage through the night, like activist forces on land occupied, not resting on laurels. Here is the moral. The battle we wage in this day and age, on this social stage, is simply and boldly made by living in ways that we fight to change. The system does crush alternatives such that would dwindle a hypocrite's role, but instead they do roll with the sick and the same, the dirty old game, then point ironically at us and say, shame. But I will wear that H upon my chest, shine a light on my pitfalls, my shortcomings all. I will use this sick system against itself, because I know there's a chance that the world we speak of, think of, and dream of could be real life. Realized, personified by we the people on the front lines, but there is no chance that we can win. If we decide our lives are sin, our battle cries debased, 'cause in that pit of death, destruction, madness, we hold on to guilt and sadness, instead of rising up to hold the diggers of this pit accountable. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Let me start off by saying that no, I will not be using a portion of today's show to talk about the New Hampshire primaries. If you want my thoughts on that, there's a good chance that I jotted down a few musings on our Twitter and Facebook. If you want to know who won, who wore what, who said what, who flipped what coin, or made some empty promise to do this or do that or the other thing, might I suggest that you... Good. Now that we got that out of the way, let's talk activism. So far, for the most part, I've given you the lighter side of activism. The party atmosphere, the good times, the good people, the creative push and the frontline fervor of standing up and telling the powers that be to go fuck themselves with a well-oiled drill bit. And yes, all of that is spot on. Activism is one hell of a good time. It's one of the most inspiring and deeply rewarding things that I've ever done. And in that depth, there is some pain. Some disgusting realities of the system that we are fighting. I hesitate to say dark side because that just makes it sound sexy and mysterious. And getting assaulted by cops, getting tear gassed, beaten up, living with PTSD, those things are neither sexy nor mysterious. Standing on the front lines, you will sometimes come into contact with the pawns placed there by the powers that be to protect their palaces, their rigged system, their flimsy facades and smokescreens. And these pawns can make you question the good in humanity, just like fighting for justice next to friends and strangers will make you believe in it. It can make you feel like all this fighting, all this protesting is hopeless, which, incidentally, is exactly what they're hoping for, because all this protesting, all this fighting isn't hopeless. It works. But justice is a long road filled with hard-won victories like giant burning tires and roadblocks that we try to dodge and sometimes hit, sometimes push through, sometimes move around. And regardless of side roads, alleyways, or highways, you keep going. But recognize that it isn't easy to look on the bright side when you physically can't see because of the tear gas in your eyes. And this is why. This is why we activists have to recognize the strain we're putting on our bodies, on our minds, on our emotions. We have to recognize that, yes, PTSD is a thing, and it's something that you can get from activism. It's not talked about really because, well, activism isn't really talked about. But if you're part of a big action where the system actually feels threatened by your raised fist, you're standing up for rights, justice, freedom, they will not hesitate to fight you, emotionally and physically. And in those moments after, it might be necessary to pull to the side of the road and engage in a little bit of self-care. Let me give you an example so this isn't just a bunch of road metaphors. A friend of mine went to his first big protest in Quebec City in 2001. The Third Summit of the Americas, as it was called, was held to discuss, interestingly enough, the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, a proposed expansion of NAFTA to include 31 additional nations in the Western Hemisphere. Technically, it's still under negotiations, but fuck me, now we have TPP. See how it's all connected, the tangled webs they weave. Anyway, at this summit, all of the influential ass buckets were there, newly crowned President Bush and 33 other heads of state, all pushing for the expansion of crony capitalism, all pushing for the advancement of corporatocracy. More than 20,000 protesters from around the Americas showed up to stand in opposition against these meetings. The systemic response was intense. Not only did authorities divide the city Berlin Wall style, with security barriers and fences protecting the sociopaths on high, but the police response to peaceful protests turned really ugly really fast. For the full 3 days of protesting, police and security authorities fired tear gas canisters, rubber bullets into the crowds, blasted high-pressure water hoses, and beat anyone, and arrested people oftentimes without any cause. And if you're thinking, well, geez, guys, just step back from the fence. First of all, fuck you. Any fence built for the purpose of allowing corporate takeovers of people and planet should be torn down. And secondly, police did not limit their retaliation to these more escalated actions and sections. A little backstory and insight into how these days many large-scale actions are organized. In short, they're split into tiers of arrestability, 3 zones clearly marked and separated. The green zone, which was all legal protesting with no risk of arrest. The yellow zone, which was unsanctioned but peaceful protest with some risk of arrest, because cops. And then the red zone, comprised of direct acts of civil disobedience with a high risk of arrest. Normally, only people in the red zone expect to get hit by tear gas or, less than lethal, weaponry. And oftentimes, those on the actual front lines will plan ahead. They'll wear gas masks, bring water bottles to flush eyes out, etc. Those way back in the green zone, like the ones organizing teach-ins, making signs, peacefully and legally protesting, probably didn't bring any fucking gas masks. But they should have. Police fired tear gas into both the green and yellow zone, even firing into places where there was no planned protest at all. This went on for 3 days, and there's plenty more to say about this action, but suffice it to say that the police response was grossly hyperbolic. And afterwards, activists weren't just dealing with physical scars. Many had what can only be described as PTSD. The activist that I mentioned before would have sudden flashbacks and panic attacks. For example, cutting an onion would cause him to tear up, resulting in an instant mental and emotional response that would literally cause him to curl up and lay on the floor shaking. And his is not a rare story. His is not a rare story of PTSD or indeed of police violence against activists, as we will hear from this week's guest, Heather Doyle. About a year ago, Heather, an experienced climber and activist, scaled a crane in Cove Point in order to hang a banner. You've probably seen actions like this from across the country, or indeed the one we mentioned before of the banner drop at a football stadium. Same issue, partnering groups. Seed Coalition fights fracking and environmental destruction using a variety of tactics, this banner hang being one of them. As is clear from the nature of the action, it was, of course, nonviolent. She's climbing. But as you'll hear, the police response, as well as the response by our quote-unquote justice system, was anything but nonviolent. Environmental activist Heather Doyle explains.
Well, from our action was in February of 2015, and we were arrested, me and the other activists on the crane. And we went through our court process for that. We both pled out to a misdemeanor trespass charge in April of 2014. And I served 33 days of a 40-day sentence at the Calvert County Detention Center for that action and for the guilty plea for the trespassing charge. During our arrest, the Sheriff's Department and the Special Operations Team of Calvert County removed us or extracted us from the crane in a very unsafe way. So that happened, but also during my arrest, when I was first being detained by the sheriffs, I was assaulted, including what happened is that when they came up to me, when one sheriff came up to me on the crane, they pulled me across this gap, which was very scary in the first place because, like I said, I didn't think they had any understanding of how they might shock load my system, my rope system, which could lead to pretty significant injury. They pulled me across, and two law enforcement officers pinned both of my arms back behind me, and another sheriff stood right in front of me and used his forearm and pressed down into my throat once for about 20 seconds. Then he stopped and just stared at me and pressed his arm back into my throat for a little bit longer. I wasn't completely choking because I was able to let out some breath and say, I can't breathe. But nevertheless, he was using a lot of force. I'm a small person and he was a very large person, and I wasn't going anywhere. My arms were being held back by the other law enforcement officers. So after he choked me, he then lifted up his foot and put the bottom of his boot on my sternum and pushed down. And I felt like my chest was being crushed. And then he laughed it off, and he said that he had just slipped while he was stepping over me. It was really scary. I felt like they could have done anything up there to me and no one would know, because there's no other people that can, there's no evidence of what they did to me. The visibility from the ground was poor.
So did this come up in court, and did it have any effect on your sentencing, or was it just sort of like, oh, that's just what she says?
No, we didn't speak publicly about our mistreatment on the crane until after our criminal charges were disposed of. There's a so, like a finite amount of press that you get after doing an action. And we really wanted the focus to be on the issue that we were there about, which is stopping this export facility and protecting the people who are living in around Cove Point. And also protesting just in general the fracked gas industry. And also, it's a very real thing that, like the thing that you're talking about, like if we talk about it beforehand, does that mean that the judge is going to hand down a harsher sentence? Like, is there going to be some sort of retaliation against us for doing that before, if we talk about it before our charges were resolved? So after our charges were resolved and I received my sentence, we released public statements just to release public statements. And it was only after those public statements were put out there that there was encouragement to file formal complaints. I filed my complaint while I was incarcerated. And the investigator came to interview me. And they decided in July, solely because we filed the formal complaints, to charge us with a false statement to police officer. So it's a misdemeanor charge. So I've been charged because I made a complaint. There's no sort of I know some folks have had a hard time understanding our situation. Like, we're not suing the cops. They're not suing us. I'm facing a new criminal charge because I filed a formal complaint and told the truth of what happened to me.
What is the procedure there? I mean, how can they prove that it's a false complaint? Like, it seems like the burden of proof for them serving you with a misdemeanor would be on them.
I've seen this happen several times, and I think we know how this goes. It's like when it's one person's word against law enforcement, against the police, there's already like a whole lot of bias towards that, especially as a person who is engaged in political protest and was like committing a crime. But it's like they're just trying to exhaust us and to tie us up and have us focus on fighting these charges instead of doing the work that we want to be doing. And it's a way to intimidate us from doing that. The one thing that's like very obvious about what's going on in Calvert County is that the Calvert County Sheriff's Department has a strong financial interest in having this project come to fruition. Dominion Cove Point has a security services agreement with the Calvert County Sheriff's Office, where they pay them $1.25 million a year. My case is one thing, but it's part of a larger pattern of intimidation that's been happening against locals who are opposed to this project and against other folks who have come to protest this stuff. They've been really rough with a lot of the other protesters. And there were reports that during another action where someone chained themselves to a piece of equipment, the ambulance, like the emergency response professionals, wanted to come to the scene to be on standby, and the Sheriff's Department and Dominion waved them off. So, and that's just like one of the examples. So it's like definitely there is a definite substantial pattern of this happening down there.
So I'm assuming that despite the shit that they're throwing at you, you're not going to give up. And I wanted to hear your opinion on, there have been a few cases in New York and Seattle, most notably, where protesters have used the necessity defense, saying that their actions were necessary because of climate change. And in Seattle, they recently won that using that defense. Is that something that you think you might be able to use in the future if this were to happen again, that you'd be in court for your actions?
I think it's interesting that folks have tried to use it. My understanding of what happened in Seattle was that the judge allowed the necessity defense, and then when the case went to the jury, part of his jury instructions were to ignore the necessity defense argument that they gave. So I've heard like mixed things. I think and that's not to negate what happened out there, because I think it's like really amazing that they allowed the necessity defense in the first place. And I totally admire folks taking stuff to trial. I think it's a very privileged thing to be able to take things to trial. And that's something that I'm experiencing with this case as well. I mean, you really do like need to have resources to go to trial. It's really expensive, and not everyone has the resources, both like monetarily or like just like resources life-wise, to go through that whole process.
Just that, in and of itself, is fucking ludicrous. That fighting for your freedom, your innocence, is a privilege. And she's totally right. It is. And it's part of the same system that is well guarded by the very people who, as Heather and I both mentioned, use it to intimidate and exhaust activists and organizations. But neither the activist I told you about before nor Heather are quitting. And we should use their stories as inspiration, but also as a reminder that we're not machines. We have to sometimes step back and give ourselves and each other some love. Valentine's Day. Some attention, some self-care. As they say, be gentle with each other so that we can be fierce together. And yes, you can go ahead and use that as an activist Valentine's Day card. Maybe throw in one of these while you're at it. It's my kind of guy. Now, being the contrarian that I am, and also anti-corporate holidays, let's shift to this week's Low-Life Scum winner, who is absolutely deserving of no love whatsoever.
You low-life scum.
Military budgets, specifically ours. If you're no stranger to the show, then you're probably also no stranger to the fact that currently the US spends more on military than the next 7 trigger-happy nations combined. You may have also heard mutterings about the $400 billion and counting mistake, the F-35 jets that can't fly at night, on cloudy days, or close to lightning. Not to mention, it's got engine trouble. Between 2007 and 2014, the Pentagon has had to ground F-35s more than a dozen times due to engine trouble. And that's not all. In 2008, the RAND Corporation, a California think tank that works closely with the U.S. military, programmed an advanced computer simulation to test the F-35's fighting ability. You know, important shit. The two analysts ultimately found that the plane was an expensive piece of shit and that it, quote, can't turn, can't climb, can't run. So, one would think, based on the evidence, that we should shift our obese military budget away from giant piles of shit that would do more good in an aviation museum than protecting national security. But fuck that. These contracts have been signed, and Lockheed Martin and the engine company Pratt & Whitney, which just sound like two really conservative douchebags, aren't going to let their profits sag because of a few minor details like these. And if you're curious what these contracts look like, the latest numbers from a selected acquisition report, fancy military speak for we're buying some shit, show that in late 2013, the government signed a $8.3 billion contract with Lockheed Martin for 71 F-35s to be delivered between 2014 and 2016. On top of that, we also signed a contract with Pratt & Whitney, the ones making that shitty engine, for $1.1 billion, covering another 38 of their shitty engines. So if you're following the dates here, which I know is hard to do if you don't want blood to shoot out of your eyes, not only have we spent billions on these hunks of metal waste, we're still buying more. We're building more. We've already earmarked money for a total of 2,400 F-35s, each one ringing the cash machine at about $108 million apiece. And that just makes you feel safe. I mean, hell, if it doesn't end up working out in the end, let's just take it apart and throw the hunks of metal at the enemy. Gotta make lemonade, right? You know, the way that kids make lemonade and cookies to pay for their fucking education. Or hell, what could $108 million do for healthcare, or environmental protection, or even our own damn veterans? Imagine what $108 million, one plane, would do for a group of veterans, physically, mentally maimed. Imagine what one plane would do for a teacher. A family living on the streets staring back at a foreclosed home, one kid dying of cancer. What could that $2.9 billion in the 2016 fiscal budget set aside for drone research, development, and procurement buy? How about the cost of one flight hour for a Predator drone? $3,000 an hour. Shit, $3,000 a month sounds like a lot to me, and I'm sure it sounds like a shit ton to a lot of people, like the 45 million Americans who live under the poverty line. Or how about the $30,000 an hour to fly a Global Hawk, one of the bigger, more impressive drones? Do you think $30,000 could make a difference in someone's life? Hell, not just an American life either. I bet that $30,000 spent in an hour that could be spent over the course of 3 years to feed a family of 4 would not only make a difference in their lives, but also make a difference in that kid's life who didn't get bombed by a drone. Perhaps it would make a difference in that man's life who didn't see his wife blown to fucking smithereens right before being offered a gun and a chance to kill those responsible. Wow, it's almost like that shit comes back around. It's almost like we could make a lot of people's lives better by not being such sociopathic, sick, deranged, trigger-happy, war-hawking fuckwits. But instead, this is what our budget looks like. There are literally 57,000 other ways to spend that money. And there are 57 million ways that money is being wasted. And I haven't even gotten into talking about private contractors and mercenaries or other mishaps so staggeringly stupid, I would doubt even the current writers in Hollywood come up with them. Like the more than $10 billion in shrink-wrapped $100 bills that we dropped into Iraq and quite literally fucking lost. There really is no way of covering it all. It is a vast network of idiocy, corruption, greed, and bloodthirsty fanaticism that can only be taken down in one way. A few profit and the many pay, but there is a way to stop it. You can't end it by disarmament conferences. You can't eliminate it by peace parleys at Geneva. Well-meaning but impractical groups can't wipe it out by resolutions. It can be smashed effectively only by taking the profit out of war. Smedley Butler, a U.S. Marine Corps Major General, the highest rank authorized in the early 1900s, and at the time of his death in 1940, he was the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. This guy knew war. He knew what made it tick, and he knew how to stop it. So for all of us on the front lines or on the sidelines taking a break, we know where we have to aim our energies. War is but one of the many horrors powered by this machine. Whatever your issue, whatever you're fighting, keep fighting. And recognize that we're all fighting on the same front lines. And with that, revolutionaries, we will wrap up this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this show with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. As usual, please check out the last slide to see the sites that I mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the windy, that's why I'm crying, Devil's Den, good night and act out.